In the mid-20th century, the discipline of history faced an epistemological crisis. The debate centered on a single question: is history a rigorous predictive science, or is it the art of telling a story? The philosopher Karl Hempel championed the covering law model of logical positivism. Logical positivism is a philosophical movement demanding that all legitimate knowledge must be verifiable through empirical observation. Applied to history, this model dictated that historical events are only valid if they can be explained by general, predictive scientific laws, much like physics. Under this strict model, the narrative form, the actual writing of history, was dismissed as literary decoration. Positivists argued that stringing events together into a plot offered no rigorous explanatory value. In his work, Time and Narrative, the philosopher Paul Ricoeur investigated this intellectual battle to see if these two positions could coexist. We will derive exactly how narrative generates its own rigorous intelligibility, step by step. Then, we will examine Ricoeur's argument that reducing the discipline of history to pure storytelling is a mistake. To rescue history from the rigid laws of physics, we first have to prove that plotting a story is a highly structured cognitive act of logic. Hard sciences rely on a forward-pushing causal vector. A causes B, which causes C. Human action, and the narratives that describe it, do not operate on a strict track of physical prediction. Philosophers W.B. Gallie and W.H. Drey proposed the concept of followability. They argued that historical understanding does not rely on predicting the future based on laws. Instead, it relies on our ability to successfully follow a sequence of actions to a known conclusion. Looking at this sequence of event nodes, think of the known conclusion as a teleological magnet. Teleology is the explanation of phenomena by the purpose or end they serve, rather than by prior causes. The final outcome exerts a pull backward through time, reorganizing our understanding of every event that preceded it. This backward-pulling vector creates a continuous, intelligible series. The beginning of a historical event becomes comprehensible through the lens of its conclusion, which clarifies which data points were relevant and which were not. Historical explanation is never a simple deduction from a general law. It is the cognitive act of successfully following a teleological sequence to its end. This logic extends past the sequence of events and into the grammar of history. The philosopher Arthur Danto demonstrated this by analyzing the retroactive structure of historical descriptions. This engraving depicts the sack of Magdeburg, a defining moment of the 30 Years' War. Consider a classic historical statement about this conflict. The 30 Years' War began in 1618. Placing this on a timeline reveals a conflict between perspective and time. An observer actually living in 1618 cannot state that a 30 Years' War is beginning, as they have no way of knowing how long the conflict will last. Danto points out that this description of the initial event relies entirely on the occurrence of a later, time-separated event, specifically the war's end in 1648. The final structural requirement of this sentence is the presence of the historian. The historian is situated in the present, looking back and linking both past events. Danto defined this three-node structure as the narrative sentence. It is a linguistic framework that bridges time-separated events, proving narrative possesses a specific capacity to organize time. Historical truth relies on this asymmetrical retroactive perspective. That is a grammatical structure that cannot be replicated within the predictive laws of hard physics. When we scale up from individual sentences to entire historical texts, we encounter Louis O. Mink's theory of comprehension. Mink distinguished narrative understanding from other forms of logic. It is not theoretical comprehension, like deducing outcomes from Laplace's mathematical laws of physics, nor is it categorical comprehension, where data is sorted into pre-existing philosophical concepts. Visualizing this as a chaotic timeline, Mink defined the configurational mode of comprehension. This is the mental necessity of holding a massive, complex array of chronological facts together simultaneously. The historian performs a specific operation. They grasp together disparate temporal elements, synthesizing them into a single cohesive mental network, a concrete complex of relations. This completes the narrativist difference. Narrative absolutely possesses its own rigorous matrix of intelligibility. It uses configuration to organize the past, without requiring scientific laws to remain epistemologically coherent. While the narrativists successfully countered Hempel, Ricoeur argued that their position did not fully account for how history is actually written. Ricoeur argued that the narrativists overcorrected. By defending the narrative form, they attempted to reduce the entire discipline of history to a mere species of story. Modern historiography operates on a macro scale. The French Annales school, for example, focuses on demography, economics, and the longue durée. The longue durée is a term used by historians to describe a slow-moving structural timespan that extends over centuries. These impersonal forces cannot be reduced to simple character-driven plots. When dealing with collective entities and vast timeframes, like the price of wheat over 300 years, intuitive narrative understanding breaks down. At this scale, the discipline requires structural, causal explanation. To maintain history's standing as a scholarly discipline, Ricoeur insisted there must be an epistemological break. This distinguishes the everyday act of following a story from the rigorous, critical inquiry of the historian. If we enforce this epistemological break, how do we prevent history from collapsing backward into the sterile, predictive positivism of the covering law model? Ricoeur solved this using a concept called singular causal imputation. This is the process of using counterfactual reasoning to determine which specific event caused a result in a one-off historical situation. This allows historians to use sociological laws and data without destroying the underlying narrative form. Looking back at our organic web of narrative comprehension, Ricoeur's ultimate synthesis becomes clear. Causal explanations and nomological structures, the hard rules of sociology and economics, are not the foundation of history. They serve an ancillary, corrective function. Think of it as a grafting process. The hard science of historical explanation must be structurally layered upon our foundational narrative competence. The two systems interlock, but remain distinct. This is the completed dialectic. Scientific explanations correct and refine the narrative, while the narrative gives human, temporal meaning to the raw scientific data. We understand time first through the configurational act of plot, but we critically secure that truth through the science of history. The two are inextricably, structurally bound.